Thank you for everyone for joining us today. For some context, my name is Caroline Murray. I'm the Export Program Coordinator here at the Export Small Business Development Center, housed at World Trade Center San Diego. We offer no-cost advising services to companies that are looking to begin exporting and those that want to streamline their current export processes. I'll include some links to our full list of services and some more information about our accelerator program, Metro Connect, as well. But today we're fortunate to be joined by both Dr. Eileen Daspro and Simona Rasic, who will be walking us through the different facets of creating an export plan, making sure that you're able to be export ready, taking your products into new international markets. So to get started, Simona Rasic is an international trade consultant. She's the co-founder of Trade Series, a tech trade startup focused on making international trade more human-centered using digital innovations. She's also the president of Women in International Trade Orange County chapter. And Simona's been with our center at Export SBDC since the beginning of 2021 and has supported 24 successful export grant applications, totaling around $115,000 in global promotion activity. Simona is also a certified global business professional and has been working in the trade industry for the past 10 years. We are also joined by Dr. Eileen Daspro, who is a clinical professor of international business and teaches at the University of San Diego, focusing on comparative management and global strategy. She has 20 years of international work experience as a professor, researcher, and manager in Brazil, France, Venezuela, and Mexico. And she is also a NASBIT certified global business professional who's developed and coordinated international business consulting projects with various multinational organizations. Thank you both for being with us today. And Simona, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Caroline, and Director Lucas Coleman from bringing the World Trade Week tradition to San Diego and organizing today's workshop as the opening event for World Trade Week San Diego. World Trade Week was first observed in Southern California in 1927, and in 1935, President Roosevelt has officially proclaimed it a national observance by the US government. It's been nationally observed since then, and May has now become the World Trade Month, a month to celebrate the importance of international trade to the US economy. Don't forget to join us in person on Thursday, the 11th at 3 p.m. It is a true honor to present today together with Dr. Eileen Daspro from the University of San Diego. Thank you to all attendees for taking time during your lunch break today to join us and learn about export planning. We have a lot to cover, so please find a comfortable seat and remember that you will have access to the video. And also you have access to our export business consulting services that are offered at no cost to you through our SBDC San Diego and Imperial Network partnership. So when you're ready to export, all you have to do is to schedule an appointment with us. Let's start with the next slide. We can move, it all starts with why, and we can move to the next slide. So it all starts with why, as Simon Sinek would say. Why should a company export? Well, 95% of world population lives outside of the United States, and marketplaces today are increasingly without border due to globalization and technology. 1/4 of global production is exported. And traditional business models bound by national boundaries have become obsolete. So small businesses must internationalize for long-term success, since global competitors now operate in a domestic market. In terms of economies, export can boost a country's trade balance, create jobs, and aid in reducing poverty. So exporting has many more advantages than just a simple increase in profits. Here are some examples of benefits. Exporting diversifies your customer base and mitigates the impact of US economy fluctuations. It can also extend your product life cycle and reduce seasonality effects. To meet export demands, your company need to improve products, production processes, and workforce skills. So it improves your performance and your competitiveness. Exporting can also lead to economies of scale when products require little modifications for the target market. Increasing exports can activate idle equipment, staff, and capital. Exporting exposes your company to global best practices, to new ideas, therefore fostering innovations. International markets often offer higher profits margins due to price sensitivity. Let's go to the next slide. Before determining if your enterprise is ready to export, it's important to evaluate your own motivation for exporting. Don't pursue export just because it is trendy, because your friends are exporting, because your competition is exporting. You have to think about why you want to export and conduct research to validate your decisions. And only after you confirm that there's a strong reason for you to export and invest in exporting and accept the risks that come with exporting, you should then assess your company's readiness to enter the global markets. And on these slides, you can see some good reason for exporting. I took this from the International Trade Center's, one of their courses. So when, let's see, if you have idle capacity or excess inventory, you experience seasonal fluctuations, you're threatened by your competitors on the domestic market, you may consider exporting. If you have research price premiums and additional costs to confirm that the opportunity for higher profits outweighs the risk, then you may consider exporting. Exporting can help smooth sales fluctuations, can prolong your product life cycle, and it can minimize the risk by selling to diverse foreign markets and acquiring market knowledge and industry knowledge. Let's move to the next slide. When an enterprise considering exporting, it needs to change and adapt its products and business operations to suit the regulations and requirements of the foreign target market. Business strategy, production, marketing capabilities, as well as transactions, sales transactions are significantly different when doing business outside the national border. So the overall export assessment can be divided in two subsections: export strategic readiness and export operation readiness. These questions that you see in these areas that you see on these slides are really areas to highlight potential challenges that could hinder your enterprise export efforts. Once you decide the reason why you want to export, then you have to look at your management commitment. It requires time and dedication to learn about exporting and to also accept the fact that profits might take a little bit of time in exporting. Then you have to assess and look at the business environment, and there are several questions within that area. You have to look at the social, political, cultural environment, and Dr. Daspro will be talking more about these in the presentation today. You look at the trade agreements, you look at tariffs, you look at regulatory compliance. Then you have to build an entry strategy, and you have to decide if you're going to enter through e-commerce or traditional distributions, if you understand the behavior of consumer in their market, what creates demand for your products in the market. And then you move into the production. You want to make sure that your export production does not hurt your domestic production, that you will be able to deliver quality products on time. You look at your marketing capabilities. There's a lot of elements that have to take place within your marketing department, and you have to consider localizations, new sales material for global marketing, social media strategy as well. Then you look into sales negotiation, the difference between domestic sales negotiations and international sales negotiation. What does it mean? What kind of data do you require when you negotiate a transaction internationally? And then how do you fulfill the order? And what are the logistics elements that are involved in a global in an export order, purchase order? Then we look at financial management, your cash flow, trade financing, what are sources of funding if you may require export capital to develop your production and to increase your production. What are some of the resources? And I will be talking about the resources towards the end of today's presentation. And then of course we look at resources management, trade resources, many of which we'll cover today, financial resources, human resources. Let's look at an example on the next slide. For example, let's say you are a beer company and you are meeting with me to discuss your export readiness. So these are some of the main areas that we will focus on. Just keep in mind that there's really no one correct approach for becoming export ready. And while some breweries may focus on domestic distribution and only explore foreign markets after building an audience, others may plan for exports from the inception. It has been done successfully. So these are guidelines that I'm giving you today, but however, export planning is really fundamental to success. So looking at some of the areas that will be discussed, if you are a beer company, a brewery, and you are sitting down with me to discuss your export readiness, distribution expansion can result in unfulfilled orders or under orders if production is not planned carefully. If a brewery has sold its products through only wholesale partner previously, it may not appreciate the variety of business models and relationship present throughout the industry globally. Producers selling only to their local distributor may be accustomed with being highly prioritized. And in global markets, you might not be highly prioritized in the beginning. Alcohol regulations vary state by state. So if you have sold in more than one state, then you are typically comfortable dealing with variations in regulatory framework and then companies that sell exclusively in California. So that is a question that I'll have for you. You should have one or two people designed to handle the responsibilities of logistics and reporting and implement a formal compliance regime. Logistics for international trade is very different than domestic, and having somebody responsible for the compliance regulatory manual in the company is quite important. Be aware of the many export resources available, and by the end of today you will. You should also have a general sense of the relative demand for your products in the foreign markets before undertaking an export expansion plan. Because a plan is only as good as the information and data you use to validate your assumptions about the foreign market. So to take us through the export planning journey today, I'm going to hand the virtual floor over to Dr. Eileen Daspro.
Go ahead and get started now, and talking about some of the components of an export plan specifically. To help us kind of talk through some of the key components of an export plan, we're going to continue with our example of a brewery, and I've selected the company, a local company to San Diego, Abnormal Brewery, literally located around the corner from my current home in Rancho Bernardo, California, just to provide some context for our analysis today. If you're not familiar with this craft brewery, they currently sell on the premises in their tasting room, and their craft beer is also available through a number of different specialty retailers throughout the country. To the best of my knowledge, they do not have any current export operations, and they operate a 10-barrel brew house with 440 barrels of capacity. So just to provide a little bit of context for our analysis of the export plan. So the very first step that you want to perform in your export plan, if it's a product, is to confirm the classification of your product. And the entity with which you want to work is the US Census Bureau. If you are not familiar with your Schedule B code, which is the product classification code for exports from the United States. So you can actually do this online. They have a tariff classification search engine you can utilize. You can contact them via email or also by phone. And I'm just going to show you online what this kind of looks like because it's a relatively simple process. All right, and it's asking me here does everyone see my screen? It's asking me here, let me just share again, make sure everybody's seeing it. And I'm just going to type in craft beer. And then it's going to ask me a couple of key questions about the type of the beer. It's alcoholic beer, it's fermented, it's made from malt, no additives. And then it provides a classification code here, the 10-digit Schedule B number for product classification, which is going to be key for a lot of our market research and also to identify the relevant tariff and non-tariff barriers for our product. So we've got our product classification code right here. That's our first step. And then our second step, is to identify if there are any applicable export controls for the product. So I should preface this by saying there are no export controls in place for beer specifically. And in fact, 95% of all products do not require any type of license to export. But as part of the due diligence process for manufacturers that are interested in exporting, you do need to verify this. So in the case of a product, which is what we consider a dual use item, so this is a product that has both civilian applications as well as military applications, you're responsible for reviewing the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, which is managed by the Bureau of Industry and Security, and checking to see if your product has what we call an ECCN number on the CCL list. That's what this list is right here. If your product does not have an ECCN number, it's what we call EAR 99, meaning no license is required for export. So that's good news, if at least in terms of simplifying the documentary requirements. If your product does have an ECCN number, your next step is to actually verify with what we call the country commerce guide. And so you can see an example of that right here. And you actually have to look up on the country commerce guide for your target country, whether an X appears for a number of different reasons that might require an export license to sell that product to that overseas market. So you have two things that you need to do. You need to first verify if your product has an ECCN number on the CCL list, and then secondary, cross-reference that code if you do have an ECCN number with the country commerce guide. If your product has an X for the target market that you're planning on selling to, you are required to obtain a license to export there. So export controls play a really important role in terms of exporter due diligence. So the next step in the export plan, kind of continuing with our discussion of legal issues, is to specifically look at tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And there's a couple of different useful tools here that you might choose to utilize. One is Descartes, which is you can use it for a free trial period if you have a business address. Market Access Map is also a really helpful tool. It's part of a package of tools that's offered by the ITC for identifying tariff and non-tariff barriers. And also, since we're kind of continuing with the beer example today, the Foreign Agricultural Service from the USDA also publishes a really helpful report on the regulatory standards and documentary requirements for exporting to specific countries' agriculture-related products. So strongly recommend you take a look at those resources as well. So I'm actually going to show you right now what the market analysis tool looks like specifically, so you can see how robust this tool is in identifying applicable tariff and non-tariff barriers. So it requires, this is just a screenshot of what the outcome of the tool looks like. So when you actually enter into the platform, it's going to ask for your product classification code. So that's why that's always the first step in your export plan. And it shows us what is the applicable tariff. So I'm using the example specifically here of potentially exporting to China to illustrate a couple of key points for you. The applicable tariff here would be 0%. It also shows you that there might be a potential trade remedy. So a trade remedy would be the example of an anti-dumping duty, for example, or a countervailing duty. These are what we consider obstacles to trade that are a response to kind of an unfair trade practice according to World Trade Organization principles. So because of the kind of ongoing trade tension between the United States and China, there are in fact trade remedies in place between the US and China. So it would be important to review them. And you can actually do that by opening up the PDF and looking up what is the applicable trade remedy to your particular product or beer in this case. What's really interesting when you look at market access map are the regulatory requirements or the non-tariff barriers. You might be thinking, well, you know, beer, craft beer, that seems like a relatively simple product. Well, when you look in market access map, you're actually going to see that there are 64 different regulations that a manufacturer and exporter of beer in the United States needs to demonstrate compliance with in order to export to China. So there are a lot of regulations. So first you want to identify, you know, what does the regulatory framework look like? How many regulations are we talking about? And then what are the nature of these regulations? Like how difficult are they to comply with? So some of them are pretty straightforward. For example, labeling requirements, packaging requirements, those are fairly standard across markets. But if we go through the list of all 64 of them, you'll see that there are others that might be a little bit more burdensome in terms of time and also in terms of investment, product specifications, inspections, certifications, et cetera. And they might just be too burdensome for an exporter to comply with. So absolutely essential to take a look at what is the regulatory profile of the market that you are planning to target. An additional comment that I wanted to share with all of you is I don't want to leave out services. Services are the backbone of the US economy, 2/3 of US GDP. And while we don't have tariffs specifically applicable to services, services also face trade barriers. We don't, unfortunately, have quite as many resources to research the potential trade barriers that are applicable to services, but they do exist. And so if you are a service business, it's important to identify what those might be. So some examples of barriers that service businesses face specifically, obstacles to the exporting of data, on foreign equity participation in overseas operations, visa requirements, professional qualifications, if you were to practice or offer service abroad. What you do need to keep in mind if you are a service exporter is that the regulatory environment for services is managed through the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which is affiliated with the WTO. And member countries actually have to publish their commitment on different services. And unlike products, where the sale of products and the regulatory issues are associated with the products classification code, when we talk about services, it deals specifically with the sector of the service. So, finance, for example, or hospitality or construction, et cetera, as well as the mode of supply. So basically, how are you exporting the service? So your industry and also how you're exporting the service will determine what is the relevant trade barrier that you face. So for example, the first mode of supply is cross-border supply. And this is when companies in the United States or companies around the world decide to export their service digitally, and they, sell architectural plans and email them to a company abroad or an importer abroad. That would be an example of cross-border supply. So depending upon the nature of the actual delivery of the service, there will be differing trade barriers. So I just wanted to point that out because this is so important for our economy. I also would be remiss if I didn't emphasize the importance of free trade agreements. This is, one of the first steps in the export plan, especially in the selection of a potential overseas market, is to identify and confirm, who does the United States have a free trade agreement with? And are, any of the US's current 20 free trade agreement partners potential markets for export? Not coincidentally, 40% of US exports are to our free trade agreement partners because products And services that come from the United States and are sold abroad to our free trade agreement partners face fewer barriers. So it's easier and it's more cost effective to send to our free trade agreement partners. And I would encourage you to take a look at the free trade agreement lookup tool to verify the status of the free trade agreement between the United States and our overseas partner, and then also the relevant rules of origin that might be in place for that particular product to make sure that you qualify to export that product abroad. So let me actually show you an example of this right now. Okay, so we're going to be exporting goods from the United States. Let me just show this again, make sure everybody's seeing it. You're going to be exporting from the United States. I'm going to pretend here that we're exporting to Mexico through our USMCA. And we're going to use the code for beer. And this is the HS code for beer for Mexico. And as you can see, kind of the current status of the USMCA agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. As of 2020, beer exports from the US and Canada to Mexico enjoy preferential treatment. So it's a zero duty. But they also make a really important kind of connotation here that what are the relevant rules of origin? So you are not automatically conferred zero duty status to enter the Mexican market. You actually have to comply with significant transformation of the product or regional value added in order to export your product from the US to Mexico at that 0% duty. So that means if you're importing hops and barley and malt from around the world, significant transformation has to take place in the United States or in Canada in order to actually export it to Mexico tariff-free. So encourage you to take a look at that tool as well to examine the applicable tariff for our free trade agreement partners, as well as the relevant rules of origin. So bringing us back now to our export plan specifically. Let's see here, everyone. Some helpful resources that you might want to utilize in order to identify an export market. So I would say, after that first critical question that Simona presented is, am I export ready? Is my company export ready? Is my product export ready? The next big critical question is, so if I'm export ready, what market should I target? Limited resources are limited. Which market should I prioritize? And we have a lot of fantastic resources we're going to share with you at the end of the webinar that will help you identify potential export markets. I'm just going to point out one specifically, the International Trade Administration's market diversification tool. It takes into account a whole bunch of different variables in market selection, which is exactly what you need to do, to take a look at a number of different tools and variables that will help identify high potential markets. So let me show you the tool from the ITA. So let me just close this up and open it again to make sure everybody's seeing it. Okay, so it's going to ask me again. I'm still, representing here Abnormal Brewery, my local brewery here in town. And it asks me for my 6-digit harmonized system number. It also asks me which countries I'm currently exporting to, because this is kind of a diverse market diversification tool. In the case of our, client here for this exercise, I don't believe they have any current export operations, but I'm going to put in that they're exporting currently close to home in Canada, and then our zip code. And then you're going to see some top results here that are really fascinating. So it's going to actually identify for us here a ranking of a whole bunch of different potential markets for export. So opportunities to diversify your market operations. They actually listed first Chile. So I'm going to open up Chile so you can see. And so they basically do all of this tool does a lot of the legwork for you, identifies some of the 10 most important markets for export or potential export for US manufacturer of beer, like Chile, Mexico, South Korea, etc. And it takes into account a lot of really relevant variables for market selection. So not only, how much are they importing of beer from around the world? How fast are they importing beer from around the world? How fast is their economy growing? What is the legal environment of this country? Is it easy to work through their customs? Do they enforce, international sales agreements? What about the quality of their logistics, personnel and infrastructure? Do we have a free trade agreement with them? So to identify the relevant tariff and non-tariff barriers. So really kind of a comprehensive look at potential markets for export. So encourage you to take a look at the ITA's market diversification tool and some of the other tools that we have available for you as well. All right, so getting back to, we've got a potential market for export. What else do we need to take into consideration? So we also want to look at a number of different variables that might be relevant specifically for our products. So we're talking about like a local craft beer. You want to examine a number of kind of country level variables that might impact demand for that product. So what is the nature of the political system in place? Do we have a free trade agreement with them? Is their economy growing? What about who drinks craft beer? And is that segment of the population, how large is that segment of the population? Maybe you want to take a look at environmental variables. Do people drink more beer when it's hot, or do they drink less beer when it's hot? And of course, legal variables as well, the relevant applicable tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and of course, intellectual property protection as well. So a number of things that you want to take into account. A lot of great resources to do this kind of research to better understand the potential for an overseas market. Encourage you to take a look at some of those. So one of my, the ITA's Country Commercial Guide is a fantastic resource for understanding better the overall market opportunities in a given country. And then they have some great recommendations to specific products and industries from the United States that have high potential in that market. So I encourage you to take a look at some of these resources as well. Once you've taken a look at that kind of big picture and the market and country level variables, we really need to do a deep dive on the industry itself. So beer, and then kind of specifically craft beer, in the market that you've identified that might have a high potential, China or Chile or Mexico, for example. How big is their beer industry? How big is their craft beer industry? Is it growing? What about the target segment that you are focused on? What is the size of that segment? And what does the competitive environment look like? Are they foreign competitors? Are they domestic competitors? And, basically how concentrated is the industry? Is there room for growth? Is there room for a new player? So a lot of great resources for industry research, global industry research. The International Trade Administration has a ton of great industry-specific tools for international marketing research, specifically focus on global industry research, which I highly recommend. Statista, that you can do some research on the web for free. And then there's also a subscription-based service, Passport, which is a subscription-based service. And, of course, the USDA, their Foreign Agricultural Service, has some fantastic resources that are industry-specific for overseas markets. So they have a great China beer market overview that you might want to take a look at as well. But there's a lot of great resources out there. Research your industry. What about craft beer specifically in the industry that you're targeting? And I'm just going to show you in the next couple slides some examples of what you could see. So for example, this comes from TradeMap specifically, and it's showing us who is basically here, who is buying the most, who's importing the most beer around the world. So the largest beer importer is the United States. And then based on value in 2021, you can see basically all of the countries kind of pale in comparison to the US as an importer, but you can help kind of prioritize markets, which are the largest beer importers in the world. You can also take a look at, if we wanted to focus in on China kind of specifically, some great data here from the Foreign Agricultural Service. You can see, beer, this is beer imports specifically from around the world. Sorry, everyone, we lost the screen there a sec. Beer imports from around the world, we can see they were on the rise. And then after 2018, 2019, the growth rate of beer imports into China declined significantly. So these are really relevant industry variables to understand what's going on between in trade in beer between the US and Mexico after 2018, 2019. And, what are current trends if I'm prioritizing overseas markets? You can also take a look at, for example, who are my country competitors? So this is beer import, the value of beer imports into China in 2022. And basically, where is China getting its beer from? So they're getting it from Germany, they're getting it from Belgium, they're getting it from France. And so this helps you better understand what is the competitive environment in that overseas market at kind of the country level. What are the major beer exporters that you're competing with if you're planning on targeting China, for example, as an overseas market? You can also take a look at, this is a specialized industry report, who are the competitive environment, who are the players? There's a combination of both local players as well as foreign players in the Chinese market. Important to understand how concentrated the market is, and is there room for growth, of course, for a new player specifically. And I would strongly recommend all of you to flesh out a competitive profile matrix. So, take the time to do some of this research. There's a lot of resources out there for global industry data, and compare you benchmark some kind of key critical success factors from your own company, your own product, to some of your overseas competitors. So, who are those key competitors, for example, in China? What are some of the critical factors for success in the craft beer industry? Is it product quality? Is it branding? Is it certifications? Is it customer service? Is it price? What are those critical success factors? And research the performance of some of your competitors on these critical success factors, and identify, is there a way for your company and your product to position itself uniquely in an overseas market? This is a critical component of the due diligence process in export planning, researching your overseas competitive environment, which include both foreign breweries in China, for example, as well as local competitors, to understand if there's space for a new entrant and how you can kind of position yourself uniquely in the market. So, and related to that research, you want to identify, who are you going to sell to? So we have some fantastic research here in the United States about who consumes craft beer. The Brewers Association tells us pretty clearly, we know who buys craft beer. They're between 35 and 54 years of age. They're more men. They the majority earn over 100K. They consume more at the brewery rather than at home. And they prefer beer type, like stout, IPA, et cetera, over any specific brand. So that drives their purchasing decisions. And they're really focused on taste, the type of beer, and then kind of the values of craft brewing, like being independent or being aligned with local business development. And in some cases, the alcohol content. So understanding, these are the attributes of who buys craft beer in the United States. But who buys craft beer in Mexico? Who buys craft beer in China? Is it the same age segment? Is it the same socioeconomic demographic? Why do they buy craft beer? It might be fundamentally different. Of course, this has to inform your marketing strategy for the overseas market. So understanding who is your target segment. You don't export to a country. You export to a group of individuals with similar characteristics, your target segment in an overseas market. So who is that potential target segment overseas? And here's just some information to kind of inform that. We can see here, for example, from Statista, these are the beer consumers in China. This isn't craft beer specifically, but sort of similar as the US in terms of age. We can also see why, what are their drivers of consumption? What are they looking for? Socialization plays a really important role. And, some that might be different, like gifting. I don't think we gift too much craft beer. Maybe I'm wrong, but, there's maybe some cultural attributes here as well of why people consume beer in China. And a couple of other key aspects of your export plan that you absolutely want to take into consideration. So, if we look at the marketing mix, your product, your price, your place, your promotion, et cetera, there are some aspects of your current marketing toolbox that might require some tweaking or some significant adaptation if you're targeting an overseas market. So this is kind of the big debate in international trade, is kind of standardization or adaptation. On the one hand, you would like to essentially market abroad as you do in your home country, because that would save on research and development costs. It would save time. But in fact, because of legal differences and cultural differences and just industry characteristics, that's often not the case. Significant adaptation is required. So first and foremost, protect your intellectual property abroad, right? You might not have a patent with beer, but you have a trademark. So make sure you protect your intellectual property assets abroad. That's first and foremost. Identify what is the consumer need that is to be done with beer. This seems obvious, right? Like to drink an alcoholic beverage, but it's not. You know, we saw from some of the data that people are drinking craft beer for different reasons. Some are for socializing, and some for the taste, some because to give a gift. And the job to be done by beer is going to be country specific. We're also going to see that in some cases, aspects of the product itself need to be modified. So the name brand. So it's difficult to differentiate a craft beer, right? There can be only so many tastes and flavors and kind of formulations. So branding and different brand names has been a really important differentiator in the craft beer space in the United States. Not all of those names translate well across countries. So actually there's a lot of great creative brand names in beer, but many of them don't translate well across markets. So that might require adaptation, like LL Cool J or LL Cool Haze, you know, outside of the US. Maybe no one understands what that refers to, although we think that's kind of interesting here in the US market. You know, even your packaging aspects of your product. So I included here, you know, actual presentation sizes are different from country to country. Here's zombie dust, and this is kind of reflection of our fascination with zombie culture here in the US. Again, that's pretty graphic packaging, might not travel well across borders. So something to kind of think about. And of course, geographic, climatic conditions, you know, will the product arrive intact in your overseas destination? And even thinking about some of the color choices of your product, you know, what are the color is the communication tool. So for example, green, which is the color of our bottle for our IPA from Abnormal Brewery, it symbolizes kind of cleanliness and being kind of toxin free, sort of similar to the US. But in China, it also has some connotations of infidelity. So maybe we want to reevaluate that color choice in an overseas market. These are important things to research in terms of your actual product strategy. Labeling, of course, is a critical aspect of product strategy. You'll see this in terms of the regulatory issues, but as well as in terms of the actual modification of your product. And so this comes from the FAST report on the import requirements into China specifically of agricultural products, and, you know, just the guidelines to label your product appropriately and to be in compliance in the Chinese market. You also need to take into account price. You know, this issue of standardization versus localization, you're going to see in practice, your price, your domestic price is likely not going to be the same as your export price, because there's a whole host of different variables that you have to take into account that often lead to what we call price escalation. So for example, tariffs, excise taxes, sales taxes that exist overseas that you are not facing perhaps in your domestic market, transportation and logistics costs, which of course are incredibly relevant. You might need to take into account purchasing power. You know, purchasing power might be lower overseas. You might have to modify your product specifically and try to recover some of that cost for your overseas market. And of course, your competitors, you know, are you priced competitively vis-a-vis some of your competitors in an overseas market? And of course, currency fluctuations as well, which of course, if you know your target market is experiencing a significant currency depreciation vis-a-vis the US dollar, it's going to be expensive for them to import a craft beer from the US, and that may influence your pricing strategy. So a key aspect here to take into account is, in terms of your pricing, are you going to only take into account kind of some of your variable cost, or are you going to pursue a full absorption costing method whereby all of the export related costs, both kind of fixed costs and overhead costs, as well as variable costs, are calculated into the export price? Now, I know Simona is going to talk a little bit more about this in a little bit in her final section, but important to keep in mind, you know, export price escalation is a real challenge. There's a lot of different elements to take into account when determining export price. So you can see here, for example, the ex-works price and the manufacturer's location here in the United States starts out at $30,000 US. And all of these additions to the final export price, so there's an exchange rate adjustment, shipping costs, customs fees, different margins by overseas intermediaries, distributors, retailers, a certificate, an inspection fee, et cetera. And that $30,000 car now became a $50,000 car because of all of these add-ons in the export price determination practice. So this is a really important consideration because it may very well force you to reassess not only how you sell abroad to maybe avoid duties or to avoid some of those transportation costs, or even how you calculate your export price so it can still be affordable for your overseas target market. Now, another really critical issue that you want to include in your export plan is the issue of payment. One of the key challenges and risks that exporters face is getting paid in full and getting paid in time. And in a perfect world, exporters would all be paid in advance, cash in advance, right? But in practice, that's actually not such a common form of trade payment because it's a buyer's market, it's an importer's market. And, if you have more favorable payment terms, people are more likely, importers abroad are more likely to buy your product. And so while the exporter prefers to be paid up front, in practice, they will often export the product and be paid later, what we call open account, which is a much riskier trade payment situation for them because they deliver the product first and get paid later. Important to assess how you're going to guarantee payment. And there's some instruments that are offered by, for example, the Export-Import Bank to protect yourselves from commercial risk. But be mindful, you need to select a trade payment tool that matches the profile of your importer. So how long have they been in business? How trustworthy are they? What kind of risk do you face in that particular market? You want to make sure you get paid. So you want to rely on lower risk tools of exporting. And of course, one of the quintessential tools to do that is what we call a letter of credit. And a letter of credit is an important innovation in trade payment in the international business space, where essentially the bank of the exporter and the bank of the importer act as intermediaries, and for a fee, guarantee that the exporter gets paid and that the importer receives their goods on time. So very critical to get the right form of payment. Another critical aspect of your export plan are the terms of sale, or what we call the Incoterms. So these are a set of 11 different rules. They're issued by the International Chamber of Commerce, and they define what are the responsibilities of both the buyer, the importer, as well as the seller, the exporter. And they clarify, who's responsible for what, who pays for what, and at what point does risk transfer from the exporter to the importer. There's a couple of different ways to familiarize yourselves with the different Incoterms. Generally speaking, the most common Incoterms are ex-works, which is a minimal responsibility for the exporter and is often recommended for exporters with a low level of experience in internationalization. Kind of freight on board, which would require the exporter to also provide inland transportation. And then probably SIF, which is an Incoterm that also requires the exporter to be responsible for international carriage. These are, again, critical for designating responsibilities in the export process. Some are for all modes of transportation, some are only for maritime transportation, but are absolutely critical in the international negotiation and sales process. So you define clearly who's responsible for what. And then related to that is, how are we going to actually get our products to market? So there's lots of different transportation modes. This is one that I think is really helpful to kind of talk you through this process is, taking into account cost, speed, and then just the availability of the transportation modes. Generally we focus on, kind of maritime transportation, which is 70% of all goods are transported via maritime, but also air, maybe truck. Very significant differences in terms of cost, right? Air is quick to market, but it's very, very expensive. Water is really maritime transportation is very inexpensive, but it can take the product much longer to get to market and maybe could be less reliable. So depending upon the characteristics of your product and your marketing needs, choosing the right form of transportation. And then to wrap up the last part of the export plan, I want to talk a little bit about kind of entry mode specifically. So how are we going to actually enter your overseas market? You've determined you're export ready. You've identified a potential market for overseas expansion. What is the right way to sell in that overseas market? And generally, this is a discussion based on, what is the manufacturer, the exporter's comfort level in terms of risk, And also, what are their resources do they have at their disposal for international expansion? They might want to have an overseas subsidiary and actually set up a store overseas, but it's too risky for them to do so, and they might not have the financial capital to actually execute that. So for many companies that are just getting started in the export process, usually exporting either indirectly through some sort of intermediary, like an agent or a broker, or direct exporting through e-commerce, or maybe selling directly to a business overseas or to a government overseas, tend to be more favorable forms of market entry. And then lastly, just to talk a little bit about distribution. So you think that you want to export abroad, and you're trying to identify a potential buyer who's going to buy my product abroad. So a couple of great resources here. The U.S. Commercial Service offers a couple of different programs, the International Partner Search, the Gold Key Service, that are specifically focused on identifying through their network of offices around the world potential distributors and vetting these potential distributors for U.S. exporters. So highly recommend that. Also the Compass service. This is a paid online kind of B2B directory, but it can be a phenomenal resource for identifying potential distributors overseas in your industry category. And then, of course, industry trade shows and professional associations are fantastic resources to identify potential distributors. The important guidelines here is, this is a critical element of your marketing mix that you have to get right. And so you need to perform this due diligence. Who are these distributors? How long have they been in business? What is their sales profile? How much of the market do they cover? Are they, do they carry the lines of competitor products? How well do they know the industry? And then if you, get to the point of actually drafting a distributor agreement, some key elements that you want to take into account are, territory, exclusivity, how much marketing and customer service support do they provide? What are those terms of payment, the terms of sale, the Incoterms? And then, of course, how much they're going to actually promote the product. Your distributor is the face of your company in an overseas market. And so it's an absolutely critical long-term decision that your company needs to make in the exporting process. So with that, I'm going to pass things back to Simona to talk about implementation resources.
Thank you, Dr. Daspro. What a thorough and excellent workshop on creating an export plan. I hope you are all excited to start working on the export plan creation this morning, this afternoon by now. An export plan is really a live document. It's constantly changing based on market of entry, distribution strategy, price strategy, and all of the other elements that Dr. Daspro has lined up so thoroughly for us. So thank you for that. Let's go to the next slide. So the global expansion journey is all about breaking down the roadblocks, the trade barriers, and how you do that. You break down trade barriers by finding the right solutions and resources to your challenges. And really the glue to bring all of these elements and all of these little pieces of this pie chart you see in the middle, I call this the export success wheel. The key and the glue is really your entrepreneurship brilliance, your passion, your implementation strategy, your time commitment to global expansion, your ability to plan for different outcomes, because in trade, we always have to accept the fact that our plan will change halfway through the trade transaction sometimes. Things change rapidly, but you are not alone in this process. You are not alone in this journey. As you can see on these slides, I put around the export success wheel, I put the logos of many local, state, and federal trade organizations. They're there to support you with resources, to support you with advice, to support you succeed and achieve export success. My role, for example, as an export advisor is not only to make sure that you have access to all of these local, state, and federal resources and programs, but to support you navigate the application process, to make sure that you align domestic business strategy with your export strategy, that you know what resource is most useful at what stage at what stage of your export development. And this is really the work that we do at World Trade Center San Diego and SBDC Export San Diego. We have a team of business advisors helping companies navigate resources and all the business strategy elements that are really needed for both domestic and global markets. Let's go to the next slide. We'll talk about a lot of these resources for the remaining time we have today. I also want to make sure we have time some for questions from the audience as well. So the goal is to really be ready for sales negotiations. So by the time that you are starting your trade transaction cycle and you're entering into finalizing a purchase order and closing the sales contract, you have to be ready. You have to understand all of the elements that Dr. Daspro discussed today. This is an average of a trade transaction cycle. If you're doing a traditional trade transaction, it takes about 20 days in the sales negotiation stage, and you have to really know the data elements that you are required to have and to know from your foreign buyer in order to finalize the purchase order, all of the information that required to be on a purchase order, and in all of the 27-30 export documentation that you will have to compile. You'll have to be very clear on your sales performance as a seller. You have several steps to go through from production to bringing and making your products available for pickup by the freight forwarder, hiring the freight forwarder depending on the input terms, what are all the landed costs, as Dr. Daspro mentioned, to bring your products to the port. What are the payment terms, the terms and the condition of the transaction, who has to perform what in a trade transaction. Each document, export document, is actually a task to be performed either by the buyer or by the seller. So this is just to give you a quick overview of what the goal is. The goal is for you to be ready to start the negotiation, to be ready to export, to understand the process of what it takes from the beginning to the end of a transaction. And that's really my role at World Trade Center San Diego, to make sure you're ready to start this process. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll spend a little bit of time. This is one of the most important work that has to be done before you start your export expansion, is to really understand international pricing strategy and your budget strategy, very strong related to your budget strategy. So much to say on this slide, but let's say if I sit down with you and you want to export, we are most likely start here. We need to clearly understand your net cost, your cost of goods sold, looking from your materials to your labor and all the variable overheads, and then international costs. What does international cost mean? Product modifications, if any, there will be a cost to that. Packaging for export, labeling and regulatory. Each country, foreign markets have different labeling and regulatory compliance. Some countries require that you print the label in that specific foreign language. Some countries have specific marketing laws that allow you to actually restrict you from saying putting certain claims on your labels, especially if you are in a beer industry. Many countries have restriction on advertising alcohol. Packing and creating and getting ready for loading the product, research and development. So there's many international costs that you have to be aware of before you can really set up your margins. You have sales and marketing overhead, manufacturing overcosts, management overhead. As I mentioned earlier, you should have 1 or 2 employees in your logistic department to really take care of the export documentation and have sufficient time commitment from somebody from your domestic department to take care of logistics. So you start with determining your net cost, and then you move into your landed cost. And you will hear in exports this term a lot. landed cost. It's the sum of expenses associated with shipping a product. And it's a very, very important calculation for small business owners, because the earlier you know your landed cost, the earlier you can plan how to cover them. You can plan your budget, you can plan to make a profit, and you can maintain competitive prices. You really cannot complete your price strategy without knowing your landed cost. And in order to know your landed cost, you must very closely work with your supply chain partners, from the bankers to the custom brokers, inspection companies, freight forwarders, because they will help you put together your cost assumptions. In an international transaction, the biggest thing that really changes is your cost of goods sold. So you have to look carefully at the cost, and you make sure you capture everything you see in the middle of the slide. And for example, if you have more than one product and each product has a different margin, based on your calculations, you might have to make decisions when you offer. You might decide you don't want to offer all your products to a specific market because of different margins and limitation you may have within your margins. So for example, if you're not covering duties, you still have to know about it, and you still have to consider it, because it's going to be part of the cost of goods sold to your customer, and you cannot leave it outside. The value chain and the margin must be, considering the value chain and the margins must be protected in your landed cost. So when you really look at the end-to-end price of a product, is going to include your margins and your counterpart overseas margin. And if you are a beer company, as you can see here, I highlight on the slide, you have to worry about your profit margin, you have to worry about your distributor margin, and the third one is a retail margin. And if you work with a government, if it's a government monopoly type of industry in the foreign market, then you have to understand what that margins means. But usually you have to deal with these three different margins, and it is your job to protect all of these three margins in order to set up your price correctly. And I might repeat myself in saying this, but this is really the most important part I want to look at. You see under the landed cost, there are several Incoterms that you'll have to be aware of. Ex works price is really in an Ex works Incoterm, the international trade, it's a trade arrangement in which the seller makes the product available at a designated location, for example, at the port of Long Beach. And the buyer is responsible for all the logistic and the cost thereafter. However, you have to know what are the costs thereafter, what are the loading charges, the export documentation, if there is a charge for that, any banking fees if you are using a bank to structure and manage your transaction, what are the freight forwarder fees and insurance from your warehouse to the port to start with. What is the cost of that transportation? And then you have terminal handling charges, and you have forklift charges. And then you have FAS, means free along ship, free alongside ship as an Incoterm. And that includes loading onto the vessel. And then you have FOB, which most of you are familiar with. It's free on board shipping. And there you have harbor maintenance fees, you have ocean freight, you have fuel adjustment. Very important, there's also currency adjustment. Currency and fuel adjustment are quite important elements to consider when you set up your price as well. You have destination delivery charges. And then we look at the SFR, CFR, cost and freight. And then you have insurance destination. So we look at the cost, insurance, and freight, CIF. And then we look at import duties and custom duties. And if you are, depending on who decides to pay and what Incoterms you have finalized your trade transaction, there will be an inland freight from the destination port to the buyer as well. So these are elements for you to consider in the landed cost, and you need to understand what these charges are when you set up your retail price, because Your international retail price, you take the entire landed cost, which already includes your total net cost on the left, and then you add the freight, you add the distributor margin, you add the distributor price to retail and their margins, and then you have to add local taxes like the VAT, and that is how you arrive at a total retail price plus taxes. Some countries may have other taxes, especially on alcohol as well. So this journey was really for you to understand how changes in any of these costs will cause a change in your total retail price, and pointing out to start with looking at import duties, look at currency, and then consider all of these elements when you set up your profit margins. Let's go to the next slide. So now we sat down and we looked at your price strategy and we looked at the competition price, and you are confident that your price is competitive and that you will be making it in this market. So now we look at, of course, these prices will set up the budget. You need budget for marketing, you need a budget for logistics, you need a budget for export documentation. So out of the price strategy, you sit down and you put together your budget, and then we look at what resources could we use to offset some of the expenses you have. And we have several resources. Like, I'm going to spend the next minutes going through these resources. Just know that each of the slide you see here today could take an hour of webinar by itself. So I'm going to today, my goal for the next several slides is to make you aware of these resources, to make you aware of the fact that at the World Trade Center, we can help you navigate these resources, navigate the application process if you're ready to export. And we're here to make sure you understand your eligibility, your product eligibility, and the entire planning for application for some of the resources. So one of the first resource is it's called STEP, and I think most of you know about it. It's a reimbursable grant program, California State Trade Expansion Program. And one of, there's two programs. There's an event program and an export voucher. This slide refers to the export voucher. It provides companies with export development reimbursable funds up to $10,000 in funding for qualified export expenses, which will offset 75% of approved expenses. So you have to spend out of your pocket an additional 15. However, keep in mind, this is a reimbursable grant, so you have to first, you have to submit an application. So you determine if you qualify, you submit an application, you will wait for a pre-approval, and then you implement the plan that you submitted with all the expenses that are allowable. And once you submit proof of implementation, you receive a check in the mail. You can see here in general the export promotion activities that would qualify under this STEP grant: participation in trade show or domestic shows that have an international presence. However, the traveling expenses are not included, but your booth space and your setting up your booth expenses would be included. Website globalization and e-commerce. Website globalization is a very important it's a very important marketing activity, promotion activity that you have to consider before you go global. And that includes SEO, website translation, building landing pages on your website specifically for foreign markets, and all the localization services that you have to do for your brand, from labeling to website to social media as well. E-commerce platforms. So if you are planning to enter a market through e-commerce and you choose a platform, some of the hosting, maintenance, and fees targeting international buyers could be covered by this STEP grant as well. Shipping samples to possible international buyers are activities that will be covered. U.S. commercial service products, and I have a slide to talk about more about their products. These are export promotion services that will support you locate a partner in international markets or vet a company in international markets, or just find out about the demand for your products in that particular market. So the services from the US Commercial Service Office would qualify for the STEP grant. And then international marketing materials and social media campaign, building your brand awareness, building your social media campaign, building your materials that you will be sharing with your international distributors, all are activities that are important for promotion, and most of them could be covered by this grant. Additional important promotion activities are export credit insurance premium fees and intellectual property protection, compliance testing, and also export research tool like Compass that Dr. Daspo mentioned. At the World Trade Center, we, together with one of the partners Getting to Global, we built a preparation tool. The preparation tool is designed to simplify the process for you. Enter the preparation tool, answer some question, and start working on the preparation, on the export activity plan. You have to have a clear entry strategy and an export activity plan before you can apply. Let's move to the next resource. Another resource, especially if you're a beer company, will sit down and go through the WSATA Fund Match Reimbursable Grant Program. This is a program through USDA, US Department of Agriculture, and WSATA stands for the Western US Agriculture Trade Association, again, funded by USDA through the Market Access Program. And it helps small Western US food and agriculture supplier remain competitive by providing 50% cost reimbursement for eligible marketing activities. There's several eligibility and qualifications. There's a specific company eligibility and then product eligibility. You must be, your products must contain at least 50% of US grown ingredients by weight, and that excludes water and packaging. So if the ingredients in your products are either farmed fish or forested in the United States, so you're an agribusiness and you're promoting a brand name, then you qualify for the program. So if the malt that's used for the beer it comes from US barley, then you do qualify. We'll just take out the water, and there is a origin calculation sheet that we can sit down and go through and determine your qualification. On the left side of this slide, you can see the funds that are available for companies. If you are a first time applicant and you are not experienced exporter, you can request between $2,500 to $25,000 per year. Once you build some expertise, the second year you can request between $25,000 and $50,000. And once you continue to build a 1+ year of expertise, then you can request between $2,500 and $300,000 in reimbursable marketing eligible international marketing activities. And the next slide, I'm very excited to show you what are some of these activities that you might be eligible for. Let's go to the next slide. I hope you can see I took only a few of the activities from 100-some pages of a manual and guide that lays very clearly for you what activities are eligible, and it also shows what activities are not eligible. So label modifications, we talked about label modification. A beer company most likely might have some label modification or stickering that have to be done to enter a foreign market. The first printing of a 1-year supply will be approved for the program. Any production of and design of the new labels will be approved. Stickers are also eligible in order to meet the foreign markets regulations. Website production and international, as long as your website design it's geared towards international market, it will qualify. All the activities have to be performed by a third-party vendor in order to qualify, so not by your marketing department, but work in alignment with your marketing department. Translation would qualify as well. If social media campaigns will qualify, so you could receive 50% reimbursement on all your social media campaign to enter Canada, as long as you can prove in the backside analytic of the campaign that you have actually targeted Canadian consumers and not American consumers. Social media influencers and bloggers, this is a very important expense. Locating a social media influencer in the market of interest for your product could really build your brand awareness and increase your sales and ease your entry into the market. Online advertising and also traditional advertisings like billboards and TV and radio and newspaper in some of the markets are still used. Those would qualify as well. Participation in international trade shows, especially food trade show like CL Paris or any of the food and beverage trade show internationally will qualify. And WSATA, in comparison with STEP, would actually cover 50% of your transportation, hotel, and meals for two employees of your company. So this is really a great program. And just like WSATA, we could sit down and look at your eligibility. We can build a marketing plan based on all of the elements that Dr. Daspro has mentioned before and look at which activities should be prioritized for you. And most of the time, it's very important that you align your marketing strategy with your distributor marketing strategy, and sometimes even the retailers. They will be the ones to tell you which marketing activities will bring the most return of your investment. So that communication with your distributor, foreign distributor, is quite important before we start building your market export plan, international marketing export plan for this particular program. Next, let's see what other resources do we have. I know I'm going to go a little bit fast through the next resources. So when it comes to trade financing, there is another webinar that we have done before, and we'll probably do another one at some point. It is a very large topic for international trade, a very important one. There are resources from Small Business Administration, which is a federal agency dedicated fully to supporting small businesses, and they offer enhanced loan guarantees to support small businesses export. They have three different products, three different loan guarantees. The Export Express, which is a shorter term, is up to 7 years, and it's used for export development, including increasing your capacity, including export promotion, and including e-commerce expenses as well. Then we have Export Working Capital. This is a short term, it's a revolving line of credit, and it's up to, the Export Express is up to 500,000. The Export Working Capital is up to 5 million. They have an international trade loan, which is a long-term loan up to 25 years, depending on the collateral that's being used. And there's also additional SBA loan programs like the 7A microloans. Community Advantage lenders also offer different SBA products that could help you increase your domestic capacity. So then it's easier for you to export. The most important part when it comes to trade finance, it's really understanding the terms and conditions, the payment terms that you are offering, the payment terms that the buyer is requesting, and then assessing your cash flow, understanding if you're able to produce on time, how much are you required to start production, what is going to be the percentage the foreign buyer will pay upfront. And if you do require financing, we will sit down and talk about preparation to meet with the lender. You must have an export financing solicitation plan. I usually work with clients on a 2-pager document that tells exactly why you need the money, how you're going to pay back, how you're going to use the money, what is the projection if you are going to have this transaction successful, or if your your current distribution agreement is going to be successful. So preparation to meet with the lender, and then determining based on your company's financial health, based on your history, based on your experience, your manager's experience in global trade, we'll look at which export financing solution is the best for you. And if you do not qualify for a loan, you might have to look into PO financing. You might have to look into factoring. We'll have to assess all of the options that you have available based on transaction merit, based on your history, based on collateral and all the other elements that a lender will look at. Let's quickly go to the next slide. This is export credit insurance, and I'm not going to spend too much time here because we have a great webinar and a blog by Sandra Donzella, who is the Deputy Managing Director in Western region. She has covered this thoroughly, all the products for us. One thing I want you to remember is EXIM export credit insurance. It is a sales tool. You can use it to give terms to your foreign buyers, so then you become more competitive on the market. You are now able to give terms because the foreign buyer qualifies, because you qualify, and now you are competitive by doing so. You're able to sell more. And not only that, but when you insure your foreign accounts receivable, now if needed, it's easier for you to obtain financing. Next slide. This is a very important resource that we have from San Diego and Imperial District Export Council. I work there closely with John Dunlop and with Ernesto Grijvala. This is a wonderful no-cost online export documentation and trade management resource. It gives you templates to all of the documentation required in export transaction. It gives you education on the transaction flow, what is the data required, what is the process, and additionally, it brings the transaction into an online environment using the uniform and complying with the uniform rules for digital trade transactions. If you go to sdidec.org, you'll be able to access the workspace directly from the front page of the San Diego DAC, and you'll be able to access this wonderful resource that will help you understand how to manage a trade transaction online and what information is needed for each of the document in an export transaction, and what is the transaction flow that you should be aware of. So make sure you note this resource. Next slide. U.S. Export Assistance Center in San Diego. This is the U.S. Commercial Service. Dr. Daspro mentioned it earlier as well. It is the U.S. government trade promotion arm, has 100 offices nationally and over 75 offices internationally. And they have several programs and fee-based export services to support you locate international partners, potential buyers and distributors, to assess markets, to perform your due diligence on a foreign buyer. The International Company Profile, it's a report that you could request in order to understand more about your foreign buyer before you sign an agreement and a sales contract with them. They also have many resources, export solutions and free resources. If you go to trade.gov export solutions, you'll find answers to most of the questions you may have in train and links to very many resources. A lot of them were mentioned earlier by Dr. Daspro. This is the team to the right in San Diego. If you are aware of them, you probably already know JQ and Colleen Fisher and Erin Davis and Kathy Bridges. We work closely with all of them to make sure you have access to all their services. Additionally, they have a great advocacy center It's supporting with foreign government procurement contracts as well. So make sure if you are interested in foreign government procurement to ask about the Advocacy Center services. Next slide. This is it. This is the contact information for the World Trade Center. If you like to schedule an appointment with one of our advisors or with myself, just email Caroline Murray at the email listed here. Check out our website and yeah, just, you know, we are here to support your global journey. We're here to make sure you have access and understand how to navigate all the resources. So do not hesitate to contact us, and thank you for your time and interest today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Simona. And as she said, here is our contact information at World Trade Center San Diego. I'll also be sending the sign-up link for SBDC services in the chat. So it looks like we just have a little bit of time for some questions. Let's see here. The first question we received, in your experience, have you seen that there is a sweet spot for companies to take advantage of exporting, whether that be company size, revenue, or headcount?
Do you mind repeating the question?
Sure. In your experience, have you seen that there is a sweet spot for companies to take advantage of exporting, whether that be company size, annual revenue, or headcount?
None of those. I think if you have a product that it is, if you have a product and there is a demand for your product in international markets, and you are ready and understand what it takes to export, you have a budget and you're prepared, it doesn't really matter what is your annual revenue currently. A lot of companies are now they're born global, so they're ready to export from the moment of inception. But it's just important to consider all of the cost and the risk that come with export. So as long as you consider everything we talked about today, you're ready to start looking into building the export plan.
Great. Another question we had, and I'll give this one to you, Dr. Daspro. What are good tools to use when determining some of the regulatory bodies and requirements in foreign markets?
Yeah, so I really find very helpful to use IntraSend's market analysis tools. It's really kind of a composite tool that communicates pretty clearly what are the main regulatory issues a product is going to face overseas. So it identifies the applicable tariff, if there's a free trade agreement. It also identifies if there's any kind of trade remedy in place. It identifies all of the number of regulations that your product is going to face overseas, and then it actually provides the documentation and in some cases the contact information to reach out to the regulatory body overseas to confirm what the regulatory requirements are. So market access map specifically, which is in the tool of IntraSend's market analysis tool, that is a fee-based tool, I find to be a very, very helpful resource for confirming regulatory requirements.
Great, thank you. Simona, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I like that tool very, very much as well. So I think if we can put a link in the chat, the tool will be very helpful. The tool has a free version and it has limited access to information, but it still gives you an idea about the market. So you can just start a free account and start looking at it and understand more about how your foreign market overview. And if you consider and you like the tool, there I don't know exactly, they have different levels of access.
Great, and it looks like we have time for one more question. This one says, are there any resources in the region related to free trade agreement advising? I know it's advantageous to use them, but I'm not sure how to go about determining my product's qualifications.
Dr. Daspro.
I don't know, Simona, maybe do you want to take that one? Go ahead.
Sure. U.S. Commercial Service is a really great resource. They have, if you go on the trade.gov and you start playing around and learning about all the resources, there is a trade agreement section. There is US commercial guides for all of the countries worldwide. In each of the guides, they will have information about what kind of free trade agreements you have and what kind of other agreements you could consider as well. So US Commercial Service, trade.gov is really your number one. There's other resources, but I will start there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending our webinar session today. And thank you, Simona, Dr. Daspero, for taking the time to share some of the resources available to our exporters here in the region. This session will be available on demand, and we'll also be sending all the attendees the information on the slides as well. So thank you again for attending, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.